Good evening and welcome to Exchanging Notes. I'm John, and this evening I have the privilege of conversing with mystery novelist and unrepentant birder, Steve Burrows. Now, Steve's introduction of Chief Inspector Dominic Jejune to the tradition of the English mystery novel both satisfies and expands the constraints of that tradition. Tonight, Steve and I will be talking about that, the whatness, the whyness, and the howness of his 5 novels, and even more interestingly, his life and craft. We just might walk away learning something about you tonight, Steve. And I will start by saying, Steve Burrows, welcome to Exchanging Notes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out.
Pleasure to be here, Joe.
Now, you were born in Birmingham. Tell us about that.
I was. Birmingham, for those who don't know, is a very large industrial city in the heart of the UK. And from a perspective of birding, it's limited to parks, in sort of in the city centre area. So we had to go out a ways to do any real nature study. And the place I've set my books is on the east coast of England, a place called Norfolk. And this was sort of the nirvana for people who dwelt in the Midlands, places that were far from an industrial core, with lots of open spaces, places where there'd be birds and sunshine and coastlines. So I had a great childhood in Birmingham, but the birding opportunities were a bit limited. So it was later on when I went out.
Birmingham is an industrial city. It's a steel city. Do you remember that? I mean, when you think of Birmingham, what sort of picture comes to your mind?
The Birmingham that I remember was a very, I wouldn't say grim, but it was a very, unrelenting industrial centre. And about 10 years after I left, it reached a sort of tipping point, and it could have gone one of two ways. They could have poured in lots of money and tried to, bring it up to the 21st century, or they could have just let it spiral down into decline. Unfortunately, they went to the first route, and they got a gentleman called Simon Rattle, who was probably the most renowned conductor in Britain at the time. Yeah. They got him to come and conduct the Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, and that sort of put things on the map a little bit. And then they managed to convince the powers that be that not every important event had to be in London. So they would export some of the big car shows and the other events that had traditionally been in Earl's Court and places like that in London, and brought those out to Birmingham. So they built a entertainment complex and everything that goes along with that. So it's, yeah.
Now, your parents, what occupations did they have? What kind of lives did they lead?
My dad is a security guard. He was when he came here, he became the head of security for Nestle's over here. And over in the UK, he worked at Cadbury's. So we've always had the smell of chocolate in the house.
Lots of chocolate.
My wife, when I first met her, would always volunteer with me anytime I had to go down and pick my dad up from work. She'd always say, "I'll come with you." And I thought, "Oh, it's nice of her to come down." And it was many years before I realized it was this smell of chocolate when he got in the car that this was why she was coming with me. But so he worked there. And my dad's 2 brothers both lived in Canada. And at the time we came over, which was very early 70s, England was in a state of not great economic shape. Mm-hmm. So the opportunities for raising his kids and his own life were better over here. So we made the jump across the pond. So.
Those were the days of desperation that preceded their choice of Thatcher, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Tell me do you have siblings?
I do. I have a sister and a brother who are both, based here. My brother is a professional traveller. He's traveled to over 100 countries, and wherever he goes, he'll find the local birding stories and send them back to me and say, maybe for your next book. My sister lives in Burlington, and she's probably my biggest fan. She's really supports me at events and is always She's very active on social media, so she's always promoting me on social media. So,
Were you a reader as a child?
I was, yeah.
What did you read?
I read pretty much anything. I think from a very early age, I couldn't put an actual age to it, but I was one of those children who was always in trouble, but never a troublesome child at school. I would always find myself in the principal's office, but it was always for minor things, for nothing unkind or malicious. I just seemed to find, or trouble seemed to find me. And then we had a writing competition, I don't know, maybe the second year of high school or something, and I wrote a piece and was suddenly called to the principal's office for a whole different reason. And I thought, hey, this is all right. So the principal at the time said to me, if you want to write, you should read. And I took that advice and I've read since then, yeah.
And that's it. So your identification of yourself as a writer goes back to about the age of 10 or 11?
Yeah, I would say it does. I always knew I would write. I never knew that I would write for publication, but I always knew I would want to write. I feel that people see the world and come to terms with the world in different ways. My wife's very, very visual and is a photographer, a professional photographer, and sees the world visually. She sees everything, not everything, but she sees things through the lens of a camera. When I see things, I think about the descriptive element that I could bring to it, or how it would unfold in a passage. So I've always been someone who translated the world through words.
And I guess a birder who for all those years was standing out there going, how do I fit this into a book?
Well, that came a while later. That I have to be honest, I never really connected the two worlds when I was growing up. I would go out birding because I enjoyed that, and then when I was doing some work, I would write. But I didn't ever really think of bringing one to join the other at the early stage.
Now, you moved to Oshawa when you were about 12 years old. Mm-hmm. What precipitated that move?
That was my dad's brothers were stationed in Oshawa, so we didn't really know much about Canada at all. And it was that traditional story that you have where, we would be getting ready to come to Canada and people would say, oh, my auntie lives in Vancouver, so you could pop in and see her when you're over there in Oshawa.
Yeah.
There was no sense of the scale of the place. So we really didn't know what Oshawa was, and we went there solely because we had family to support the move and help us through. And then my dad's job was right downtown with Nestle's, so we had the choice of driving from the East End or the West End. And at the time, believe it or not, the drive from the West End was a lot easier. Now I think it's the other way. I think every time I come in from Mississauga, it seems to me the traffic's worse coming into Toronto from that end. But back then it was an easier commute, so he made the choice to move us to Mississauga and come in from there.
Now, you got a degree in English at York University. What drew you to English? Was there nothing else you could think of, or was there something particular that drew you to study of English?
Well, I went as a mature student. I was already working, so I went for my own interest. And it was that love of literature again, of reading great works and being able to read them in a forum where everybody was, able to discuss them and was doing the same thing, as opposed to me just going and getting a book on, 19th century American poets from the library and reading it myself. There was now a forum where I could discuss that with other people.
Did you find the exercise of writing essays and assignments and stuff like that instructive or anyway fulfilling of your urge to write? Yeah, I really enjoyed those assignments, and it was clear that not everybody in the class did. People would be set the papers, and I'd already be thinking, oh yeah, I can probably work this in, or I can do that. And in conversations with other classmates, there was this dread of having to actually write something, and I never really, I wouldn't say understood. I never really appreciated how difficult it must be for them, because I just thought, okay, yeah, 5,000 words, that shouldn't be a problem. I'll whip that up. And then after university, for some reason we're about to find out, you took a left turn and went to Hong Kong. Tell me, Mr. Burrows, why Hong Kong?
Why Hong Kong? Okay, I'd been a teacher over here. I taught in Richmond Hill and Newmarket, and At the time, they had a system, I don't think they have it anymore, but it was called a 2/3 or a 3/4, where you could work for 3 years for 3/4 of your salary and bank the other quarter. And then you could take the 4th year off completely for a whole year, and you would draw on that salary that you'd banked. So my wife and I, we love to travel, so we thought this was a great opportunity. So we did that. And when it was our turn to travel, we just simply kept going west and went west until we came back to Toronto.
Came to east.
So we went all the way around the world. We went to about 20 different countries. We were traveling for a year. And when I came back, strangely, I just couldn't settle into the day-to-day routine of teaching again. And after a couple of months, I'd been back. And my wife was a nurse at the time, and she came back, and we were sitting and looking across each other at dinner table and said, "How's this settling in thing going?" And we both said, "Yeah, it's just not working." So, as fate would have it, the hospital she worked at was actually the Grace down here. And a friend of hers was from Hong Kong, and they were just advertising for what they called NET teachers, native English-speaking teachers. This is a long answer, but it'll explain.
It's good.
So what had happened in Hong Kong, when it had been, when Britain had relinquished its claim to the territory in 1997, there was a real outcry amongst all the parents in Hong Kong, because English had been the medium of instruction in the schools, and now they were proposing to make Chinese the main medium of instruction in the schools, main language. And so all of the Hong Kong parents felt that their children would lose the competitive edge in the business market, the world markets. So to appease them, the Hong Kong government said, okay, well, we'll hire one teacher for every school in Hong Kong who's a native English-speaking teacher. So they had this massive scheme to hire people from all around the world who are native English speakers. And so I was part of that. I applied to be part of that scheme and was successful in my application. So Rich and I went back to Hong Kong.
And you were also an editor of Hong Kong Birdwatching Society, and you contributed to Asian Geographic. Any particular birding prizes, as in birds you won't see elsewhere around there?
Yeah, the Asian Geographic thing came about. When, like most people who've not been to Hong Kong, my impression when I got on the plane was it was this densely packed urban jungle, and I was just going to have to give up my birding until I came back. But in fact, about 40% of Hong Kong are protected country parks.
Really?
And there's an incredible diversity of birds there. There's, Hong Kong is about the size of Ottawa, and there are about 560 species of bird there, whereas in all of Canada there are only about 690 or something. So it gives you some sort of perspective on the species diversity there.
Everybody's going to Hong Kong.
Yeah, so there were lots of opportunities to go birding. But there was one particular place called Maipo Marshes where a lot of the birds were migrating on the flyover would drop in, including some very rare ones. And the first article I wrote for Asian Geographic was about Maipo Marshes and about the rare birds that you found there.
Now, did you move back to Oshawa after Hong Kong?
I did, but we were there 6 years. Yeah.
And what's the big lesson you took away from that?
From being in Hong Kong?
From being in Hong Kong.
Well, just that, what we assume to be global knowledge is absolutely not. I was teaching in a high school, and these were bright kids. I mean, really, gifted, intelligent kids. And I would mention Shakespeare, and there wasn't a kid in the room who'd heard of Shakespeare.
Really?
Not one.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, it's because, he's not Chinese.
Yeah.
And, he wasn't read in Chinese. Now, as they go to university, of course, they get a more global education. But things like that, things that I would take for granted that was sort of universal knowledge, absolutely wasn't. So it was a really interesting lesson to take away.
Now, I'd like to jump forward a bit to 2014 when you published your first book, A Siege of Bitterns. The Globe and Mail called it a major debut, of a new Canadian talent. It was one of their top 100 books of 2014, won the Arthur Ellis Award for Best New Novel, and was shortlisted for the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. Now, I'm going to try a synopsis on this. You tell me how I'm doing.
All right.
Listen to this. We meet Inspector Dominic Chejun, a superstar detective who'd rather be watching birds. He's posted to a town in the best birding country. Unfortunately, a prominent ecological activist is killed. There may be a feud over bird watching lists. There's a second murder, and as happens in whodunits, everyone has something to hide. How was that?
That was pretty good, pretty good. I should probably jump in here and say that when we'll talk about how I got the book published, but when I went through with the editor about the bird watching list, she said, really? This way? And I said, yeah, that's the whole point, though, is that he's proposing that it is, and everybody's having exactly your reaction. This is such a bizarre reason for a murder mystery.
Yeah.
So once I kind of converted her to read the book, then she was okay with it.
People do not understand the passion of birding, how it can lead to nefarious crimes. Tell me something. Now, if I may say this as gently as possible, at this time you were not a young man in your 20s. Why, at this time in your life, did you suddenly decide, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write a book? Why did it happen?
Okay, well, yeah, you're right. I think it was about 21, 22.
Okay, were you? Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I had always played around with writing, and as we discussed, I'd always seen myself as a writer. And I'd submitted various things. When I was in Hong Kong, I had a pretty good career as an environmental journalist with Asian Geographic. But even that came sort of later on. I wasn't published in my 20s or 30s. But I've always worked full-time, and I still do now. And writing has always been sort of a pastime for me, a hobby. So there was never anything hanging on getting published. I really wanted to. I thought it would be lovely to. But I didn't ever pursue it as a career. So I would write things, send them in, have them rejected, and think, well, that's okay. And then I just wouldn't send them anywhere else. I just wouldn't make sense.
What were you writing? Were you writing short stories?
No, I was writing, and it's a great exercise for writers. I would say, come across a story, like I was in Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan once, and I was talking to the ranger there about how they were acquiring the land and the challenges. And I thought this would be a great story for National Geographic. So I actually wrote a complete article with the interviews, and Risa took the photographs as if I'd been commissioned to write it for National Geographic. So I really polished it, and it could have gone in. I think it was of that quality. But I had no commission to do that. So I sent it in, and they said, no, thank you, but, thanks for trying. But I was doing that sort of thing all the time. I would write articles on things that interested me and just send them in on spec.
With this novel, did you suddenly say, you know what, nobody else wants this, I'm going to write a novel? And why a mystery novel?
Well, a mystery novel really because I really enjoy the genre.
Okay.
I like the masterpiece theatre things, the BBC productions. I've been a fan of mystery writers from Agatha Christie through P.D. James, through Colin Dexter. I enjoy the genre myself. And I suppose I thought, well, I could give that a go.
Yeah.
I think, I was drawn more to that genre than anything else. And I felt that I knew a little bit about what made a good mystery because I'd read so many.
Okay.
So I think there was a comfort level in trying something that I had a framework for. Yeah.
How long did the first one take you, beginning to end?
It's hard to say. It was probably 3 years.
Not bad.
But that was 3 years of just nights and weekends and doing it when I wanted to. I had no contract for the first book. I had no agent. I had no publisher. So I just sat down and got the idea and thought, I'm just going to write this and see where it goes. And so I was completely at leisure to do it and also to put in anything I wanted to. And indeed I did. The first draft of it was, I think, 125,000 words.
That's about right.
And well, they came back and they said, when
Too
they
long?
eventually said they'd take it, they said, we'll take, if you can cut it to 100,000 words, we'll be happy to publish it in our format. And I said, yeah, of course. Now I'm going to be published, of course I'll do that. So they said, well, we have people in-house who can do that for you. And I said, no, I'll do this. It's fine. So after about a month, they contacted me and said, how's it going? And I said, well, I'm down to about 124,400, And they said, yeah, that's what usually happens. Why don't you send it in to us?
You start off by taking out the conjunctions, then you get stuck.
And the things that say chapter 1, those that came out.
Now, you're with Dundurn Press. Could you describe your path to publication? Who did you send out to? What kind of responses you got? Was there an agent involved at any point?
Right. I had, because I'd written for Asian Geographic, and I don't mean it to sound immodest in any way, but I knew I could write and people had paid me to write. So a lot of times I think with new authors they need the validation that can you write for publication, and I knew that I could. So what I thought I needed was an agent to get this material, first of all to tell me if he thought this product was sellable, was a sellable product, and then to get it to a publisher. So I went to the writers' meeting, the one they hold in Ajax every year. It's
The Writers' Union?
Yeah, the Canadian Writers' Federation, I think it might be, or something like that. And I went there specifically looking for an agent. And I never did find one. But I met a lady called Barbara Fradkin, who's an author. And I was talking to her, and she's lovely. And I said, could you tell me how I might approach an agent with a property that I already have finished? And it doesn't have a publisher, and there was no commission. And she said, well, I don't have an agent, she said, but I'm with Dundurn, and I believe they still accept unsolicited manuscripts. So I thought, well, this is good news. So I found out who I was supposed to send it to. It was a guy called Michael Carroll at the time. And in fact, Dundurn did accept unsolicited manuscripts. I believe now they don't, which is really unfortunate. But at the time they did. So I sent it in to them, and you'll hear authors tell you, well, I sent it in and I just forgot all about it. I just completely...
That's a lie.
You're not going to work that hard on like 120,000 words and then just completely forget you send it in. I think what they mean is they'd given up hope that it would be accepted. Yeah. And I certainly had. I sent it in April, and I'd heard nothing by October. So I thought, well, I guess it's just gone the way of some of the others. But it was curious because publishing is a very courteous industry, and you usually get a response. It's usually thanks but no thanks, or, have you considered digging ditches or whatever. But there's usually some sort of response to a submission, and there was nothing from Dundurn. And I thought, well, that's that. And then in November, I got an email from an editor called Alison Hurst at Dundurn, and she said, we're really interested in this property. Is it still available? And I said, well, it is, yeah. I hadn't sent it to anybody else. I just sent it there. And so we began that dialogue. And it only became apparent then that they only used to read the unsolicited manuscripts once a year, which was in October. So it had been sitting there all this time, and then I got to it, read it, and liked it, and then called me up for a discussion. So I went in, we had the discussion, and then they decided that they would take the property, yeah.
And you did not relax at that point, because a year later you had A Pitying of Doves come out in 2015 and A Cast of Falcons. Now I'd like to ask you, in connection with the publisher, did they say to you, Steve, we want a book once a year for the next 5 years? Were there any constraints like that?
Yeah, well, what happened was, I think it's fair to say that nobody knew you never know how a book's going to do, but nobody knew how this murder mystery featuring a birder was going to play, what sort of response it was going to get. But it did get quite a positive response, and as you say, won this award, and it was, well reviewed. So Dundurn came back and said, could you do 2 more for us? And I was delighted that they'd asked, but I thought at that point, you know what, I may need an agent now.
Yes.
I may now that we're getting into a 2-book contract, and I'm not sure what's going on. And so I went to see. I actually sent a copy of the book to Bruce Westwood Creative Artists, and only found out afterwards that this guy is sort of one of the absolute pinnacles of Canadian literature. I just chose his name from the list.
He's one of the big names in Asians, yeah.
And so I sent it off to him, and I would never have done so had I known he's standing in the community. And he called me up, and he said, well, sounds lovely. He said, so come on down for a chat. So we went down and we hit it off. So he became my agent. And then when we got to, I think the second book had been published and the third one was on its way. And they were sold in the UK. Sold in the UK. And at that point, Dundurn came back and said, would you like to do another 3, which would take us up to 6? Mm-hmm. And I said, sure. But they like the 1-a-year format because it usually hits spring, which is the birding, the apex of the birding activity. So it's got a already built-in market from the birding side of things. And I've been able so far to do 1 a year, but it's getting tougher with the job I have, and my grandkids are growing up a bit now, and I'm doing other things. So it's been the first 3. Because you're a new author and you want to keep the publisher happy, you don't ask for an extension of deadlines. You hit
don't
the deadlines.
sleep.
So with the 4th one, I said, well, you know what? I went to Columbia, so I'm running a bit behind. Can I have an extra month? And they said, yeah, okay. And then the 5th one, I said, you know what? I've just started a new job. How about 2 months? Sure. And then the 6th one, I just phoned them up and said, you know what? It's just not going to happen. And they said, okay, well, how about the end of August? And I said, yeah, I could do that. So I just sent it in last week. There.
And as I was saying, in 2015, A Pitying of Doves, a killer ignores expensive jewelry and takes a pair of turtle doves. A Mexican consul attaché is found murdered. Suspicious bird sculptors. Now that's unusual. Embittered aviary owners. Diplomatic cooperation and pressure is the key to that one. Then, of course, in 2016, A Cast of Falcons. A man falls to his death from a cliff. There's a mysterious book in his pocket. Dominic Chejun knows he could solve this murder, but it is going to endanger the life of someone he loves dearly. And you read those synopses, even as poorly as I'm doing them, and you say, yeah, I'd like to read that book. Tell me about the appeal of the mystery novel. What are the ideal qualities of a mystery novel? In what ways do you aspire to reflect those qualities? And in what way do you aspire to subvert them?
Okay, great question. I think a mystery... I always see this as sort of a contest between the reader and the writer, and I think you have to be fair. I think the reader doesn't want what I call the Scooby-Doo, solution, whereas there's only 3 people in the entire thing and one's murdered, and who could possibly be the killer. So I think they want some sort of complexity in it, and they want a chance to tease out the clues and work it out. But it has to be a viable solution when you get there. Mm-hmm. I think the evil twin brother hiding in the attic that appears in the last but one page, I think he's perhaps not fair to the reader. So I think you've got to give them a chance to solve it. And the ideal mystery to me is one where you get to the solution and you go, I should have seen that. Why didn't I see that? So that's kind of what I aim for, that people are going to go, yeah, he did tell me that. In fairness, I could have put this together. So I like to honor that tradition in my mysteries. In terms of subverting them, I've tried to flip things on their head a little bit. A lot of the police procedural type detective work novels that I've read have involved an antagonistic relationship between the principal and his superiors. Yeah. It seems to be a bit of a staple. So I thought it'd be fun to flip that around and have this guy absolutely adored by his superior officers and the top brass. They all think this guy is fabulous. And so he's got a different set of pressures to deal with, but he doesn't have that antagonism. His antagonism comes from defending his idea that, I can figure this out, but there's probably a birding angle. And nobody else is a birder, so they're going, is this guy crazy? So I switched the antagonism and made him much more in tune with his superiors than being an antagonist. And also, I thought usually it's the situation where you have the seasoned veteran as the main character, and he has this naive sidekick, and he's kind of teaching him life's lessons as he goes. And I thought it'd be nice to flip that around. And because he's young and he's in a different country, he's got this older sergeant who's got all that life knowledge, and he's kind of mentoring the main character instead of the other way around. So I thought I'd play with the conventions a little bit in that one. Yeah.
Allow me to ask you a question that one never asks a mystery novelist because it's so obvious. Which is, of course, your plot ideas, the central device of the mystifying murder, the careful laying out of clues, all that stuff, the core that has to work if anything else is going to work. How do you come up with that after 5 books?
What I generally do is I think of a plot and then think, something that is not plausible, such as the dead person did it. There's a person who's died, and yet this person has committed. I'm just giving you an example here.
Yeah.
This person has committed the murder in some way, and clearly that couldn't happen. And then I think, well, why couldn't it happen? So I'll take something that seems to be impossible, or at least highly unlikely, and think, well, why? If the person is in a room with 100 people and is alibied by all these people, how could this person possibly have committed a murder at this time? Clearly it couldn't have happened, but why couldn't it have happened? And can I plot backwards now to find out how it would be possible?
So are you starting at the conclusion and working your way back?
Yeah, I think in a murder mystery, and I'm asked this question now and again at writers' conventions, because a number of authors will start at the end of a book and work their way to the beginning. And some other authors will tell you that, I just let my characters lead me where they want to go, and then I kind of weave it all in together at the end. And I think with a murder mystery, you have to know where it's going to end. You have to know who done it and why they done it, because you've got to then lay this trail of breadcrumbs leading to it. And I think if you weren't clear yourself in what was done and how it was done and when it was done, then I think you'd find yourself having to write all these loops back in at the end. So there is, I think, a compulsion to know what's going on before you start writing. Yeah.
Let me ask you about something else that's very important, from who done it to why do it. Rumor is you're a birder.
Yeah.
Guilty. Tell us. Why is birding the most amazing thing we could ever do? What are the elements of birding that keep you doing it? What do you give to birding? What does birding give to you?
Birding is it's just a pastime that you can you don't have to commit huge resources to it, and you don't have to commit huge amounts of time. I also play the guitar, and you can't do that without working hard to get there. You can bird without working hard at all. You can look at birds in your backyard, and you can just sit there and have a coffee, and things will drop into the feeder. And then there's all sorts of levels. You can go to be an absolute expert, where you go on these expensive trips and go for individual birds, an entire trip just to see one bird. But there's no compulsion to move from one level to the other. You can stay at your comfort level with birding as long as you want. And I also love the idea that with birding, every spring I'll go to the forest and I see species that I recognize. And these are, like old friends, and I recognize they're coming back again, and I see them. And so there's that familiarity. But there's also always something new that's dropped in that I've never seen before. So it's a case of being familiar with what's going on and what you're facing, but also constantly being presented with new challenges in terms of identification.
Really? What could the human race learn from birds? What do they do that we need to know about?
They just get on with things.
They get on with
things. They
things.
just get on with things. Their entire existence is built around the idea of just existing and propagating and moving on. And I think when I see them in the rain and the storm, and they're not scurrying around and they're not trying to moan about it or do anything else. They just kind of sit there and say, okay, well, this is rain.
Yeah.
And when the rain's finished, okay, this is sun. And they still have to feed and they still have to mate and they still have to nest. And so I just like the to and fro. They are utterly in tune with the rhythms of nature.
At what age did you start birding seriously?
Seriously, I was probably early teens.
Really?
Yeah, I would say at the point where I could choose to go out by myself, or with a friend and just go for a walk for a couple of hours. I believe I have memories. My mum's told me the story so many times, maybe it's just implanted now. But she used to take me around the parks when I was very little and I was already interested in birds. And I believe I may have those memories of being interested in birds even then. But yeah, as somebody who would actually take a trip out to go birding, I would say early teens, yeah.
That's interesting. Let's move from the who done it to the why do it to the how is it done. Steve Burrows as a writer. Tell me, sir, another question you're never supposed to ask writers is how you do it. Do you have a routine as a writer? After 5 books, do you have an established beginning to end process?
Yeah, I think now, I have to be honest, with the first book there was no pressure whatsoever. It was just writing. It was just an exercise. I would go and I would type on the computer and there was no more thought of it than that. I didn't print up the pages and have this building manuscript. I just wrote it on the computer. When I got the contract for the second and third book, all of a sudden there's an expectation and there's also a deadline. And there was an element of, I don't know, I wouldn't perhaps say anything as strong as panic, but there was certainly some anxiety that, am I going to be able to produce a book here?
Again.
Yeah. Now I'm on, just finished the 6th book, so I know I can. And that's taken away that sort of anxiety that, when I get the contract, will I be able to produce a book? Whether it's any good or not is something different, but I know I'm going to be able to produce 100,000 words. So that's something that's developed throughout the course of writing the different ones. In terms of the process, for the first few books, I worked from home. I had a home-based job, and I worked mainly with a company that was based in Vancouver. So by noon, they were just coming into the office for the day. So I had sort of the mornings to just do my writing. And I had all this sort of time. I didn't realize it then, but it was just this luxurious amount of time I had. And then my grandson started coming for breakfast, which they do every morning. We live on the route. Their mom's a teacher at the school. It's just up the road from us, and we live on the route. So she drops him off for breakfast. We have this family breakfast with my wife and myself and the 3 grandsons, and then I drop him at school before I go on to work. So they started coming, although I was working at home now, any time after about 7 o'clock in the morning was gone because my grandsons were there, and then I was going to work. And then just in the last year, I just got a job where I'm actually in an office now in Scarborough. So what I had to do for the last book was to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for a couple of hours till the boys came, and then come home at night, and when everything else was quiet, about 9 o'clock, then write for another couple of hours.
When you look back at your 5 books as a series, are you pleased with the progression of skill or just the way in which you handle the form?
I think what I do now is I edit myself better.
Okay.
I used to, I like to write lyrically. I like my sentences to have some sort of, a lyrical nuance to them. And I like to express the language as well as I can. And that was always the driving force.
Yeah.
Where everything I wanted to say it lyrically, and I wanted to say it using beautiful language. And then I realized that you don't have to say everything like that. There's times when you can just say what you mean and save the lyricism for a description of the landscape or whatever. So I'm much more comfortable now just writing a plain sentence than I was. I would go back, if it was a sentence that was just a straightforward sentence, I'd think, I have to make this beautiful. And now I'm okay leaving it and saving the beautiful language.
Save the poetry for the poets, huh?
Yeah.
They need the money.
That's right.
When you're talking about writing sentences, I'd like to ask you a bit more about that. You've written 5 books worth of sentences. That's quite a few.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the sentence? What is a good sentence? How does a sentence work singly and in combination with other sentences?
I think a sentence should always be... you should always be conscious of writing a sentence, so it should never be cliched, it should never be lazy. It should always have a purpose. The purpose, as I just said, may be just to lay out a simple, descriptive passage about a room or a person, and not have much more to it than that. But it should always have a purpose within the book itself. It should always be leading you somewhere. If you're telling me something in a sentence, why? Why have you done that?
Are you writing, for example, now shorter, more declarative sentences than you might have a few years ago?
Yeah, I'm more comfortable doing that now. As I say, it's part of this process where short sentences used to bother me. I used to think they weren't finished properly. And so I'd go back and I'd use semicolons a lot. Yeah. And then I, as I say, I've become more comfortable with the idea that it's okay. If it's the 3-word sentence and it works, you can leave it and then move on and do the long sentences later on. Yeah. So I do like to vary it a bit now. I still, as you might be able to tell, have a tendency towards verbosity. So that comes out in the writing. And also sometimes in the writing, I find getting the idea down just turns into one big long sentence that leads on, and I have to go later and parse that. Yeah. But I'm much more comfortable with the skills that I'm developing now.
Who do you look to as a writer? What writers do you look to, not just in the form of the mystery novel, but all different genres, for their skill in plotting, or their skill in characterization, or their skill in writing sentences? Who are the writers who stay with you these days?
The great American writer Scott Turow.
Really? Scott Turow?
Yeah, I think he's a terrific writer of plot. I think he's on his game. There's been, like all writers, there's been highs and lows, but when he's good, he's very, very good, Scott Turow. It's something that's very important to me is a plausible plot. There's never this big stretch with, I didn't quite believe that, but, I'll let it go. Everything fits nicely into his stories. And again, you get to the end and you think, that was just it's almost as though he's just told a story that's a slice of life where things have happened which are all plausible. So I really admire that. For expressive, descriptive passages, and character insight, John le Carré, I think is...
Really?
Yeah. I think, again, he's 80-odd now, so his later work, I feel, is not quite there for what it was, but in the 70s and 80s when he was writing, I think he was probably unparalleled for me in terms of his ability to tell. And again, he's telling a spy story, which in some circles is not considered highbrow literature, but he never compromised at all on the quality. I mean, some of the passages he wrote would have been, at home in any sort of work.
And the endurance, too. I look at people like John le Carré or someone like Graham Greene, and I think to myself, how could you just keep writing book after book after? Are you tired,
Yeah. I think one of the questions I get asked at a number of writers' forums is, where do you come up with your ideas? Not the plotting idea, but where do you come up, where do you get an idea for a book? And when I get that question, I think, that question probably hasn't come from a writer, because writers just have ideas. I probably now have at least a dozen ideas that I think I could turn into a viable story. I'm not sure all of them would make it to a finished manuscript, but it's just not a problem for me to come up with an idea and think, yeah, I wonder if that would work as a book. I'll put that in the back burner. So for somebody like Le Carre or John Le Carre or Graham Greene to just keep coming up with books, they're writers and they know that's the way they express their view of the world or their take on the world. And having the ideas to as the vehicle for that, I think, is not a problem for them.
See, something that interests me with you. Let me try that again. Yeah. Something that interests me about you is that you're about 7 years into a serious writing career, and I look at you and I think, I wonder how that's affected him. Is he more observant? Is he more solitary? I mean, do you think now that you've really made this serious commitment and you've stuck to the course for about 7 years, has writing changed you?
It's taken away that there was always this striving inside me that I wanted to be a writer, and clearly that's okay now. I don't know that it's changed the way I look at things. I think I used to joke with my wife that I've always been a writer. I was just never published. And I think that's probably still true, except now I am published. But I don't think my view of the world has changed, or the way I see things has changed. It's nice. It really is nice to be able to go into a bookstore and see a book on a shelf. That's for a lot of years I would go into bookstores and go, "Why isn't my book on it?" Well, because you haven't written it yet. But that's nice. But otherwise, I don't think so. No, I don't think it's profoundly impactful.
Except I'm sure you've honed your scheduling skills. Now, in 2017, you published A Shimmer of Hummingbirds, and 2018, A Tiding of Magpies. I'm going to try the synopses again, unless you would like to know. Yeah. Okay. A Shimmer of Hummingbirds. Inspector Dominic Chejun is on an overseas birding trip. The rainforest can be a dangerous place. An accountant is murdered. His girlfriend is in danger. Should he speak up, knowing it will cost him his career, or should he let a killer escape justice? The moral dilemma. I like those. Now, in A Tiding of Magpies, one of Dominic Chejun's long-closed cases is reopened. Secrets may come to life. Again, people he knows are threatened by this. People are starting to question Dominic's behavior in the present and in the past. And the facts just don't seem to be clear. It just don't seem to be there, but that's where the truth is found. The thing that strikes me about A Tiding of Magpies, first of all, is that what's come to fore for the main character, Dominic Chejun, is a moral dilemma that possibly for the first time you're beginning with him for your case. It's hard to put Dominic Chejun in a tradition. He's part Sherlock Holmes, he's part Philip Marlowe, he's part Miss Marple, I guess. Yeah. But tell me about curating him. Where did he come from? Did he come to you talking and walking, or was it a very slow assembly that created him?
Okay. What happened was I wanted to write an English village murder mystery. The traditional closed community, the seaside murder mystery. But I wanted to set it in Canada. And as hard as I looked, and I tried to do this for a long time. Again, this was the first book, so I didn't have any parameters to work with, but this is what I wanted to do. But as hard as I tried, I realized it was always going to be a regional book anyway. It was either be a maritime book or a prairies book or, the mountains. So it wouldn't be all-encompassing as a Canadian book. So I thought, well, I'll compromise on that, and I'll go back to my original love, which is the village murder mystery, and I'll put it in the UK. But I'm going to take a Canadian detective and put him there. So at least I've got my Canadian element. So I decided very early on that's what I was going to do, and there was a lovely tension there between him being Canadian and being in the UK, so he's kind of a novice. He's also a birder and no one else is, so we've got that tension as well.
Yes.
And then he's from the metropolis, and now he's going to this very, very small community where, 30 years later you're still the newcomer.
Yeah.
So we've got that element going in as well. So I knew that's what I wanted to do with him. But the actual character was a very deliberate choice on my part to push back against the stereotypes that exist of bird watchers. There was an article in USA Today a couple of years ago, and Knox College in Illinois had done a survey of of what people thought was creepy. And the top three things were men, which I don't know, men, clowns, and bird watchers were the three creepiest things that they came across. And my wife, of course, loved this because she said, "Oh, you qualify in all three schools there." So, but it's not, it didn't surprise me that bird watchers were on that list. I think the non-birding community sees the bird as, I wouldn't say creepy necessarily, but certainly odd.
It's the binoculars.
Yeah, I think that's probably what got something to do with it. But there's this idea that they're, misanthropic or solitary, and they don't fit into society, and they're just these oddball characters. And I thought, I'm going to push back against that, because I know a lot of birders who are just decent, everyday sort of people. Somebody's very, very high, works at the ROM, and somebody has another great job at Sick Kids. So these are, well-respected individuals who've got great jobs and clearly function in society quite well. They just happen to like birding. So I thought, I'm going to push back against all these stereotypes, and I'm going to put him in a very good relationship, a stable relationship with a woman he loves. I'm going to make him well-respected in society, and I'm going to make his birding an incidental part of his life. It's not this all-consuming thing where, he's got a dead body and he just drops everything and rushes off to see this rare bird. Like, he takes his job seriously. When he can, he goes bird watching. So those were the elements that shaped the character of Dominic. I wanted to, push back on all fronts against the stereotypes.
Has he evolved for you over 5 books? Do you know things about him now that you didn't know in the beginning?
Yeah, definitely from book 1. When I wrote book 1, I just threw in everything that I thought I wanted to put in. Everything. There were a couple of great love stories in there, and there was all sorts of stuff. So when we got down and they wanted to take 25,000 words out, 20% of the book, a couple of those storylines had to go. But I left a couple of remnants in there. One was to do with his brother, and one was to do with this background of this early case that had driven him to prominence. And these were really shadowy references. And I didn't know truly if I was ever going to get a contract for a second book. But when I did, I thought, well, it would be interesting to develop both of those things.
Yeah.
So now we have, this relationship with his brothers developing, and what's the problem there? And then if this early case was such a success for him, why is it so troubling to him? So I developed them through the first 3, the second and third book a little bit, but I still didn't take them very far. So when I got to book 4, I thought it's probably time to start wrapping one of these backstories up. I didn't want to be one of those, you've seen this TV series where, we're into the 8th season and we still don't know what happened to this girl's sister. And by 8 seasons in, I think, I don't care. Like, if she died, if she's still alive, it doesn't matter. So I thought, we won't drag it out that long. I'll roll it up after about 4. So in the 4th book, I began to roll up the backstory of Dominic's brother. And in the 5th book, I did roll up the backstory of the first case. And in doing so, I kind of had to invent the past for Dominic that I'd never done so before. So I had to build in these other elements to him that he didn't have, certainly I never touched on in the first book.
Yeah. Now, when I look at the sort of the mystery novel on a sort of philosophic or, social level, I see one major thing in the whodunit, which is that the whodunit is really an essay on social justice. There's this character like Diogenes who goes out and looks for an honest man, or like Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am. I'm wondering, in your books, when you look at them, do you see returning preoccupations, philosophic concerns, any sort of themes?
Yeah, I try as much as possible to. I don't go in for the gore in terms of the death. I don't describe the wounds at great depth or the postmortems, but I try to keep it as real as I believe it would be in terms of the psychological impact on Dominic. Like every death scars him and kind of takes away a little bit more of his humanity, and makes him doubt humanity a little bit more. And so I've always tried to never make light of any of the deaths and the characters in there, the police officers. And I understand, I do have friends who are police officers, I understand the function of dark humor. Like the real police are dealing with awful situations, and they have this dark humor that gets them through it. But it's just never sat well with me on a television show where this corpse is lying there. It's a life extinct, it's somebody's father or husband or whatever, and the two detectives are cracking jokes over it. That sort of thing never sat well with me. So I try to make sure there's a real impact, an emotional impact to a death, and that everybody's aware that this resonates throughout the community and the family. So that's a theme I come back to. I just want to always, because we all face choices every day, and they're not always life or death choices, but there's certainly these moral dilemmas that we all face. And I try to create interesting ones for Dominic. He's always going to have to decide, do I do the right thing at great personal cost, or do I take the easy route, and will I be able to live with myself if I do that? And so I just want him to have those struggles. Yeah.
So you can see him evolving then and really becoming a bit more cynical, or having to deal with more emotional weight as he grows through the books, I guess, then.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if cynical is, or I certainly don't want him to become more cynical.
Fatigued,
but
perhaps.
certainly come to the realization that, people are capable of truly terrible things, and it's not, sadly, in his case, it's not isolated because it's always in this small village, so it's, he sees, and I try to make sure the motivation or the motives are not transparent.
Yeah.
It's not going to be straightforward sex or straightforward money or straightforward, power struggles. There's going to be more to the murders than just a straightforward motive that might have been trotted out other places.
At this point, I would like to do something that's probably about 40 years late, which is I would like to welcome you to Canada.
Oh,
it's okay.
Nice
I was busy that day. Yeah, they say welcome too.
It's nice to be here.
I had things happening that day. I'm sorry. Tell me about Canada. Does Canada now mean the same thing it meant to you when you first came? And what are we getting right, and what do we need to work on?
Canada certainly doesn't mean the same now when I came. When I came, I was an Englishman and remained an Englishman for a very long time, an Englishman in Canada, and went to English pubs and played soccer and did, darts and did all the English things. It wasn't that I didn't like Canada. I love it very much, but I just was always an Englishman in Canada. Mm-hmm. And then I don't know why particularly the two things are combined, but when my first grandson was born, Risa and I decided we'd get Canadian citizenship. And at that point, I really did become Canadian. The ceremony itself was profoundly moving. I came from a democracy, functioning democracy in the UK, and came to one that was pretty close to a democracy here. But I'd got certain freedoms and expectations of things, and I looked around the room in the ceremony and saw people coming from countries where it was expected that they would be grabbed off the street, or expected that they might be beaten by the police. And I realized just how fortunate I was to be here, and it was an extremely moving moment for me to be in that ceremony. And from that day, I've really felt myself to be Canadian. And it's one of the main reasons why there had to be a Canadian element to this series. As you travel around the world, and I was in Asia for a very long time, you realize how fortunate and how blessed we are in Canada to have so much environmental awareness. I saw some awful, tragic destruction of environmental places and situations in Asia that was simply the result of this lack of awareness. Where, well, what do you mean? Why can't we build over, just concrete over this wetland? At least here there's a voice that says that's just not right. We do a lot of things really well here in Canada, and I'm very, very pleased with the strength of the environmental awareness. I think occasionally the political winds shift, and recently there was a weakening of the protection and the environmental laws, which I think is unfortunate. And I think there's been research in the animal world and in the human world that the loss of something has a greater impact on us than gaining something. So, in other words, if we gain a piece of wetland, if that's saved for us and conserved, we're very happy. But if we have a piece of wetland and that's protected and it's taken away from us, the scale of our unhappiness is greater than the scale of happiness when we're given something. So I think to lose things like the strength of the Endangered Species Act and the Environmental Protection Act and the environmental assessments, to lose any of that, I think is very impactful and disappointing. I think we should be only going one way. And of course, the big thing now is that the countries of the world have committed to preserving 17% of the land mass as protected land in one form or another. And frequently I go to conferences and people bemoan the fact that Canada is so far behind in this. But I mean, it's all about scale. Canada's a pretty big place. 17% of the Canadian land area is an immense amount of land. And if we were out to get there, it'd be great. But, to say that, well, we're not there yet, whereas, we're behind places like China and stuff, well, it might well be true, but I'm still happy with where we are in Canada, but I think we could do a bit more.
Yeah. Pursuant to that, I would like to give you a couple of minutes just to speak to any topic you'd like to speak to. If you have any current projects, political or social causes you'd like to tell us about?
I'm not... I've never been a fan of using a public forum for political views. It's something that I didn't get here because of my political views, and I don't think people came here to hear them. So there's been a couple of occasions when I've been on panels and it's drifted towards the political side of the spectrum. And I just feel that it's an imposition.
Yeah.
I don't feel, if I'd run on a political platform and all these people had come, I'd be happy to do that. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel like I have the mandate to express political views. I just, from a writing perspective,
yes,
I'd like to discuss that for a very long time, as I've said, I wanted to be a writer and was a writer. I just wasn't published. And then I got to the point where I felt that I would not become a published writer. I'd sent in these articles to magazines and newspapers and various journals, and they hadn't been published. I always got great feedback, please submit something else, we're happy, but this just doesn't fit us. And I just kind of, at one point thought, well, it's probably not to be in terms of publication, but I still write, and I still want to write, and I still did. And then this came about sort of quite suddenly. I'd written this book, and the things started to snowball, and then I got published. So I would say to writers, I understand that it looks like there's mountains in your way, but if you just keep on doing what you're doing, you don't fail at anything until you stop. And before this book, for the first book, I would have said, yeah, at some point, if you've been trying long enough and it hasn't happened, you might want to change your focus. But I really am living proof that without an agent, without a publisher, without a contract, you can get a book published. And I think it's important for people who are not yet published to hear that, because it seems to me that more and more opportunities are being... It used to be when I started, you could send unsolicited work. Then it had to come through an agent. And now even agents are becoming very, well, what have you done previously? And so the bar for unpublished work seems to be going higher and higher. But there are still paths through there. Good work, I think, still find a home somewhere. You just have to keep on going.
Better late than never, and never give up, boys and girls.
There you go.
Yeah. That's today's message. Yeah, that deserves some applause. A truth that needs to be lived. Yeah. I have a very important question to ask of you, sir.
Uh-huh.
Rodney Dangerfield, in his epitaph, it reads on his headstone, "There goes the neighborhood."
Right.
W.C. Fields proposed that his epitaph read, "All things considered, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." What would you like your epitaph to read?
Yeah, this is one I've struggled with previously. I think something along the lines of he appreciated how fortunate he was.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that Steve Burrows appreciates how fortunate he was. Steve Burrows, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you plan to continue this series now that you've done the 6?
I do. Excuse me. I just had a meeting with my agent, and he asked that very question. I'm out of contract now. We're having completed the 6th book in the series, but they've done reasonably well, and they've been picked up in the UK and in the US. And I'm in a really fortunate situation in that I believe I'd be okay to start the 7th book, and it's going to find a home somewhere. My publisher, Dundurn, is going through some internal changes at the moment, not seismic, but there's enough going on that my publicist is on maternity leave. She's leaving, and one of the editors has gone for some other assignment for a while. So there's a lot of flux at the moment. So I'm comfortable that they just haven't got back to me because they haven't got around to it. And should it be the case that for whatever reason they decided not to continue, I feel that the books, as I say, have got enough of a following now that I think the agent would be able to go to another publisher and say, hey, would you like to pick up book 7? And I certainly have a couple of ideas for books 7 and 8. Yes?
It sounded like you originally said you had published articles with journals or magazines before, but before you got the book contract. But then at the end here, it sounded like you were saying you hadn't been published at all.
Yeah. No, I had. I'd been fortunate. I spent a lot of time writing articles and sending them in and not getting them published. And then I did eventually get articles published, and I actually got a job as a field editor with a magazine called Asian Geographic. So at that point, I was writing a field editor. They said to me one day, would you like to be a field editor? And I said, I would love to be. I said, what's a field editor? And what a field editor is they would send you out into, or you could choose yourself to go and to cover a story, and it was a guaranteed publication. So the magazine were happy for me to choose my own stories, go and do the interviews and research, have my wife do the photographs and send them in. So I was able to get a lot of stuff published as a field editor. So I did definitely have a career as a published journalist, an environmental journalist, before I started writing the novels. But I went through a long time where I was sending stuff in and it wasn't finding a home. Yeah, stuff that was not...
Are there any other questions?
Also, you mentioned that you were working jobs. You said you worked a job at home, and then you worked a job out of home, and you're working a job now. Is that referring to this journalism?
No. I have a full-time job, and I joke with my writer friends. They really, you can do what, and they give you money. How does this work? So so I'm the academic manager of a college, and I oversee the delivery of 15 programs. And I think it's about 65 faculty now. So I kind of oversee that. That's my day-to-day job. So and it's a lot of fun. I enjoy it because I've also been a teacher for a lot of years. So I hope, some help that I can give to the faculty about how to deliver things. Thank you for your question.
Do you have any good tips on writing query letters?
Writing
The
query letters. Yeah, great question. The question was, do I have any tips on writing query letters? You have to do exactly what they ask. I thought for a long time I know better. So the publisher would say, this is what we want in our query letter. We want to know this, and we want to know this, and we want to know this. And I would think, well, you know what, I'm not going to tell you all that. I'm just going to tell you how good I am. So, but you need to, like, every line is in that query letter. When they've got that form on the website, every line is there for a reason. And if they say, who is your audience, who's going to be, take that question seriously and don't just say, well, people who love good literature. You have to say, no, people who have an interest, excuse me, who have an interest in this particular genre, like really take the questions on their form seriously and address every single one. Because I've heard them, time and time again from the publishing industry that we don't have. They get a lot still of unsolicited stuff, even though they say they don't accept it, and they say we just don't have time to go through this, and they're looking for reasons to call that number. And one of the best ones is they didn't answer the questions. They didn't answer the questions. No matter how good the work is, they're not going to even get to it if you've not jumped through the hoops for them.
Do you have any other questions? Just a second, please.
So I'm going to preface this by saying that, amongst other things, I was a park naturalist. Do you have all your toes?
I do. Yes, I have been lucky enough to go traveling in all sorts of interesting parts of the world. I've been to, I just recently came back from Northwest Territories up in Wood Buffalo, and that was, that was way out there. I should perhaps briefly just tell you that when I wrote the first 3 books, and I cycled through the seasons in the UK, spring, summer, and fall, and there's lots of opportunities for descriptive writing. And when I got to the 4th book, I was suddenly in winter. And I thought, well, it's okay, but there's only so much, it's kind of limiting for an author. It was cold and wet, it was cold and dry, it was cold and sunny. So I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I juxtaposed that with some tropical setting as well? So I went to Colombia to write the 4th book, to research it, A Shimmer of Hummingbirds. And I did part of it in Colombia and part of it back in the UK in the winter. And my wife normally comes with me on these trips. And she said, oh, Colombia. And I said, yeah. I said, I think there's something like 490 species of poisonous snake down there. And she said, yeah, I'm busy that week. So I ended up going on my own. But and then, so as the series has gone on, I've been able to go to all of these different locations. And of course, the more remote you go, the more chances you take that things are going to go wrong. It was minus 32 one day when I was driving through the park, and I was at least through Wood Buffalo, and and I was at least 80 kilometers from the nearest telephone pole, like any sign of human activity. And I got out of the car to just experience the park in this cold. And you do think, I turned the car off and I thought, I sure hope that thing starts, when I get back in, because that's a long walk in the cold. And it did. And I was so confident that I went back in the park at midnight and drove in about 50 kilometers in the dead of night because I went to see the Northern Lights. And I got to see that. And again, I wanted the experience, so I turned the car off so the lights would die and I'd just be me in the park. And it does cross your mind that, this is lovely, but boy, I'm in a lot of trouble if I turn that key and it. But fortunately, it was a good car and it started up. But you do have to consider these things. You really do when you're traveling. I mean, there's dangers everywhere. Yeah.
Any other questions?
You can say it now.
Do you plan to continue your dual focus, your dual theme, birding and mystery writing?
Yeah, it's certainly in the question was, do I plan to consider the dual theme of mystery writing and birding? Certainly in the Bird and Murder mysteries. I think I would like to try a standalone murder mystery that had nothing to do with birding, and I would like to try a standalone novel that wasn't a murder mystery at all. So I have ideas for those, and at some point I think I might break from this and then pursue one of those. But
Any other questions? Just a second, please.
yeah. So I was just listening to the announcement. Yeah. Yes.
I'd like to know who decide your title of the books, 5 of them. Who decide to write the title? And there is a certain forms that are similar. And what do you think of that? And did you do it purposefully?
Oh, great question. Thank you very much. My wife, who's normally here, will prompt me with the things I should say, and I forgot to say this, so I appreciate you bringing that up. The question is about the titles. Who decides on them? I decide the titles. They are all the collective nouns for families of birds. The one that people will probably be most familiar with is A Murder of Crows. There's an Unkindness of Ravens, A Parliament of Owls. But these are all collective nouns for families of birds. And I chose them because of that, because of the theme. And there are some wonderful ones out there. An Ostentation of Peacocks, A Flamboyance of Flamingos. So I'm never going to run out of titles for these, that's for sure. I can do another 20 titles on them. But yeah, that was my original decision to do that. And when I was signed to do the second and third book and the fourth, fifth, and sixth book, they said normally when they sign multiple books, we don't expect to have a title for them. We just call it Property 2 or Property 3 or whatever. But in my case, I was able to give them the titles of the next 2 books right away because I just liked A Pitying of Doves and A Cast of Falcons, and I thought I wanted to write those books. So I know for a lot of authors it's a real struggle to come up with the title, and it's really, for me, it's the easiest part. Once I get the title, then I'm off and running. So,
Anyone else? Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Steve Burrows.
oh, thank you very much.